Welcome to Autonomia, the show where we bring ideas from the libertarian left to everyday people and foster conversation on what we believe, in hopes of proving we all have far more in common than we are trained to believe. My name is Hayward, and I will be your host. Our intro and outro music are excerpts from a song called A Bigger Cage is Still a Prison by System Failure. In the event that you'd like to look up this song, the band spells System, C-I-S-T-E-M, for political reasons.
There's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky, hear the animals as they go about their lives, feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes, but tonight this cell keeps me enclosed.
For about the first half of my life, I identified as a Republican. I grew up in a household that always voted Republican, and political discussions were not uncommon. The attitudes of my immediate family could more accurately be described as right-wing libertarianism, but I don't think either of my parents knew or know that term. As I transferred to a public school, my already libertarian attitudes made for a fairly smooth transition into the socially liberal space. Due in part, I must confess, to having mostly liberal teachers, my views began to fall more into the realm of centrism or even liberalism itself. This wasn't so much because my views had changed, but I had been exposed to additional information, history, context, and honestly, additional people. My cloistered worldview could no longer justify itself in the face of new information. I was never told I was wrong. I was simply given new information and adjusted my views accordingly. This could be because as a child I was absolutely fascinated by science and the scientific method. If my hypothesis was incorrect, it would be irresponsible and downright unscientific to retain a disproven idea. As I went to college, my horizons expanded further. I met even more people, learned even more history, and the centrism that I had once held didn't seem to make sense either. In 2011, the Occupy movement and outright revolutions swept the world. It was a time of tremendous social upheaval and political tension. It seemed many of the myths that underpinned our culture that had been dashed in the Great Recession had given way to a desire for something else. It was around this time that I began to ask serious questions about the nature of our society. I detached myself from my assumptions about how our society is run and tried to view it from an outside perspective so I could better analyze it. At the time, right-wing libertarianism was surging, and I quickly fell into that milieu, as well as developing a strong interest in conspiracy theories. As Occupy slowly faded away, or was crushed under police batons and choked by clouds of tear gas, the revolutions of the Arab Spring were co-opted by military dictatorships, as in Egypt, or devolved into grinding, nightmarish civil war, as in Syria. It became hard to not feel helpless and depressed. The return to normality and seemingly immediate forgetting of all the magic, experimentation, and optimism of Occupy, and the profound physical distance from the lung-melting chlorine gas and flesh-shredding barrel bombs of Syria made me feel like I had been let in on a secret and was now expected to just pretend I had never learned of it. It was as if the Pandora's box of my soul had been opened. I spent several years partying and consuming a reckless amount of alcohol as a means of numbing myself enough that I could pretend to be like the calm, happy, well-adjusted people who just assumed that all was well and always had been. In 2014, the year of my graduation, I planned a trip overseas, one that I did not plan on returning from or surviving. Shortly before my flight across the Pacific in December of 2014, the Michael Brown verdict was handed down. Officer Darren Wilson was found not guilty. By this point, I had drifted across the country and was staying in Oakland, California, home of the Black Panthers, one of the most militant Occupy encampments, site of the Oscar Grant riots, and generations of rebellious experimentation. Needless to say, the events in Oakland that quickly spread to Berkeley were second only to Ferguson itself. I had never seen cooperation at that scale, especially not an open rebellion and rejection of the dominant social order. There was an almost magical camaraderie to it. Total and complete strangers, nearly everyone anonymous behind black masks and t-shirts, charging through clouds of tear gas and concussion grenades, people helping each other to defend space that they had taken from the city government to voice their rage. It was an incredible thing to see and experience, and for all its warts and problems, it was the spark that lit the fuse of a generation.
The trees form a secret green embrace, their arms beckoning to swallow me whole. I want to climb over these rooftops and over these fences and escape to the places none of these guards would go.
By this point, it was fair to say that I was pretty radical. My care for my family, my neighbors, total strangers, and the world itself ran up against the utter futility of petitioning the powerful to act morally, and was contrasted by the immediate national recognition and the state scrambling to find ways to appease the rioters. MLK said a riot is the language of the unheard, and we all know we would have never heard the name Mike Brown if Ferguson had not burned. It is very likely that the runaway militarization of police would have continued largely unopposed, gliding off the residual national trauma from 9/11. After all, that's how they passed the Patriot Act, a now almost universally opposed piece of legislation among anyone who values freedom. Starting in Japan and migrating west, interviewing hundreds and then thousands along the way, I found disturbing similarities among the working people of the world. In short, nobody is truly happy or fulfilled. Most felt like their work ruled their lives, and any hope of a personal life came at the expense of sleep or housework. They missed their families, they missed their children, they missed the infinite possibility that so accurately captures the state of the youthful soul. They were tired, they felt hopeless, and they were desperate for a way out. Eventually I found myself in Greece. I made contact with a radical there online and arranged for a place to stay for the duration of my time in Athens. While most people who visit Athens go to the Acropolis, or visit a restaurant that allows you to smash plates and scream, "Hoppa!" I went to Exarchia. Imagine a district that had separated from the government, within the capital city of that government. Its name literally translates to outside authority, and you really get that impression the moment you arrive. The walls of buildings are covered in art, political flyers, and culture of all kinds. I met people from around the world: rebels, refugees, artists, students, travelers, philosophers, and more. How did this place exist? Perhaps you remember the Greek riots of 2008. Greek police murdered a 15-year-old, and the country went to war with the police. Greece has been the site of intense internal conflict for decades, and this killing threw dynamite into the smoldering coals. It was like being in America after the Revolution, but during the War of 1812. They had managed to create this incredible refuge of freedom, joy, and culture, but it was under perpetual threat from the loyal servants of the government. During my time there, Exarchia was raided twice. The intense street battles that unfolded in front of me as people defended their homes and their freedom from police invasion is hard to describe. The level of brutality that they so casually inflicted on people surpassed anything I had ever seen. Beyond all the clouds of tear gas and all the grenades that to this day have left me with significant hearing loss, if the police cannot dislodge the residents from their defensive positions, they call in the cavalry. As I was trying to take in everything around me and trying my best to breathe, I heard shouting, and the whole crowd began surging up the street. Unsure of what was happening, I followed. To my right, on a side street, I saw a column of headlights speeding toward us. They were showing no signs of slowing down. Two-man motorcycles driven by specially trained police rammed into the crowd. It was hard to tell what was bones breaking and what was motorcycles hitting pavement. It all blended into an overwhelming mess mixed with screams of terror and agony. This situation was made immeasurably worse by concussion grenades raining all over the place from police that had fallen off their motorcycles. The blinding flashes and incredible force of those blasts could feel like they were enough to knock you over and leave you completely disoriented. Most of us as we ran up the hill were probably half blind and mostly deaf. I was at the far left of the crowd, so by the time that they had got to where I was, most had fallen and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the other residents. One of the cops took aim at me, but I was moving faster than he could turn at his speed. Rather than being struck directly, my leg was run over and he lost balance and rammed headfirst into a building. I didn't bother to check if he was okay, and I doubt you would either. After 10 minutes of revving motorcycles, people screaming, explosions, and crashing metal, I noticed an eerie silence outside the door of the building where I had taken shelter along with a few others. The lion-hearted residents of this otherworldly place had managed to beat back the invaders and drove them back to the edge of the district. I had never seen this before. I've seen demonstrations hold space against police assault, but I've never seen the police retreat. We occupied the Polytechnic Institute, which in addition to being a profoundly symbolic place in the history of resistance to tyranny going back decades, is also the citadel in this fortress of freedom. We took care of each other, we tended to the wounded, and made sure everyone was safe. The police retreated shortly after daybreak. By morning, it was as if nothing had ever happened. These raids were not, and are not, uncommon. Few things are more embarrassing to a state than a functional separatist district in their own capital. With the new Greek government, Exarchia has once again come under intense repression as the government tries to crush it once and for all and open up the space for gentrification and commercial exploitation. The fighting continues. When I was there, I learned from the refugees from Syria that there was a territory in the north of the country where another experiment in freedom was being carried out. People were sick of Assad and just as unwilling to allow ISIS to rule over them. These people were the YPG and the YPJ, and their home was called Rojava. I seriously considered going. I had seen the horrors of ISIS and met many people that had fled the viral apocalypse that was the Syrian civil war. I wanted to do something to make this world a better place and create space where people can be happy again. I wanted to be able to interview strangers and hear happy stories rather than misery, exhaustion, and broken dreams. My time in the Exarchia Autonomous Zone was incredibly formative for me. It was the first example I had ever come into contact with that real and sustained freedom was possible, and those years of hopelessness I felt didn't have to be the rest of my life and the future my children will be born into. Exarchia gave me hope. Autonomy is possible. The Greek word for autonomy is autonomia, which is where the name of this show comes from. After a lot of soul-searching, I decided to continue my journey rather than likely die in the Syrian civil war. I made this decision because I come from a land so steeped in propaganda and so heavily controlled that people have no real idea what freedom is. I come from a land where people think they are free. What would be the best use of my life? How many people from my country have seen what I have? How many people would want to spend the rest of their life putting themselves out there to speak their truth, knowing full well that most folks wouldn't listen, knowing full well that I may be seen as a freak or just naive? I thought of my family. They'd never understand a decision to join someone else's fight in a war-torn desert on the other side of the world. But if I came home, I could make a difference and be with the people I love. My travels took me to several other autonomous zones throughout Europe. I saw the results of people dedicated to freedom and disabused of the myths of this system. I thought of people back home, suffering and with no hope. I don't know that I can give someone hope, but I do know that people deserve better than this. If I can play some role in making this happen, I can say I have fulfilled my promise to my childhood self. I promise to do everything in my power to create a world I will not have to apologize to my children for. So the intention of this project, as I have previously stated, is to take ideas from the libertarian left and bring them to everyday people. Naturally, being from the libertarian left, I feel that these ideas are important and worth spreading. I hope as this project goes along, you'll agree. There is no shortage of leftist podcasts out there, and they are incredibly informative, and I try to follow everyone that I find. I'll link some of them in the show notes. Though between the dense and esoteric language and the sheer complexity of some of these ideas, there's often a minimum threshold of background knowledge required to even engage with them. I came from the right, and I consume an enormous amount of right-wing media, especially talk radio. I don't think we on the left are going to be able to have productive discussions with folks on the right or even the center if we sound like a bunch of ivory tower nerds completely and utterly detached from the real-life experiences of people on the other side. I'm obviously not the first person to come to this conclusion and attempt outreach. Nevertheless, it is something I am passionate about, and it is something I have taken on as my full-time job. In fact, the only reason you are hearing my voice right now is because the host of a local conservative radio show who had me on as an open leftist encouraged me to do this after our interview. The subject we talked about is the same subject we will be touching upon briefly today, the often overlooked and chronically misunderstood armed left. I'm going to start with a few quotes. Certain forms of ammunition have no legitimate sporting, recreational, or self-defense use, and thus should be prohibited. I do not believe in taking away the right of a citizen for sporting, hunting, and so forth, or home defense, but I do believe that an AK-47, a machine gun, is not a sporting weapon or needed for the defense of a home. We urge you to listen to the American public and law enforcement community and support a ban on the manufacture of these weapons, referring specifically in this quote to the AK-47 and other so-called assault weapons. There is no reason why citizens on the street today should be carrying loaded weapons. All of these quotes are by the same person. Probably Obama, right? Maybe Clinton. Well, no. Literally, every single one of these quotes is from none other than Ronald Wilson Reagan. Here are some other quotes. Any unarmed people are slaves or subject to slavery at any given moment. Huey Newton. Sometimes you have to pick the gun up to put the gun down. Malcolm X. The workers must be armed and organized. The whole proletariat must be armed at once with muskets, rifles, cannon, and ammunition. Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. Karl Marx. The totalitarian states can do great things, but there is one thing they cannot do. They cannot give a factory worker a rifle and tell him to take it home and keep it in his bedroom. That rifle hanging on the wall of the working class flat or the laborer's cottage is a symbol of democracy. It is our job to see that it stays there. George Orwell. A Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection for which the law refuses to give. Ida B. Wells Barnett. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Mao Zedong. I am afraid of a monopoly of the means of violence by the police and the military, much more afraid of them than ordinary criminals. Edward Abbey. Most people aren't aware of these quotes. Most people aren't aware of the long tradition of armed activism on the left. Even the armed strikes of the labor movement are largely forgotten. This situation is made incalculably more muddy by the right-wing media talking about socialist, communists, and leftists in general wanting to take away your guns. Don't forget that Karl Marx quote I read you just a minute ago. There has been a long push for gun control in this country among liberals. However, the left, who has been in conflict with the dominant social order and faces constant need to defend itself from both state and private interests, has had a more pragmatic relationship with firearms. Liberals are often content to call the police to solve their problems. The left remembers all the times the police gladly crushed their strikes, raided their social spaces, and consistently, willingly upheld the inequities of this system. We know our history and have long ago learned the value of an armed working class. It's also worth noting that gun control in America has almost always had its roots in racism or classism, sometimes both. Laws barring blacks and indigenous people from being armed used to be common in a country that enshrined the right of white free men to be armed. This shows that the government knows the power of arming the oppressed. These are some fairly basic leftist points on guns, and they can be found pretty commonly in leftist spaces, especially in the past few years. In Virginia, a slew of new gun control laws were being pressed despite the large-scale discontent of the people. The annual Lobby Day rally in Richmond was expected to be especially large this year, and it was. An article in Vice titled, "Why This Antifa Group is Siding with Thousands of Pro-Gun Conservatives," circulated widely and was copied by many other news sites. These articles mostly included the original quotes, where the Antifa rep explained briefly a few leftist critiques of gun control and insisted it was their fight as much as anyone else's. Well, after half a decade of fear-mongering, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and a lot of sloppy, problematic activism, people on the right went nuts with this story. Everything ranging from death threats to elaborate conspiracy theories of agent provocateurs trying to cause chaos and make gun owners look bad were splattered throughout the comment sections of a dozen news sites, and probably more than I could even ever begin to find or look up. This is especially ironic because the neo-Nazi accelerationist terrorist group, The Base, had several of its members arrested before the event for planning to do just that. So the right was worried that the left might do what the far right was actually planning to do. This is pretty common, folks are very worried about Antifa, but the hard right is the one that has the body count. The left explained why they supported gun rights, and they were roundly ignored. Well, the day went off without any major incident. Leftists were present doing outreach and identifying members of the far right that were there. But primarily they were there contributing their support for the Second Amendment from a frequently misunderstood and ignored demographic. I also learned today that they coordinated with some medics and set up a hidden emergency clinic in a nearby abandoned building in the event that a terrorist attack occurred. Luckily, it didn't. Will the right learn from this and step out of their hyper-insulated media bubbles? Probably not. A couple of years back, the RCP, something of a pariah on the left, called for nationwide protests on November 4th. Somehow this campaign, called Refuse Fascism, was confused or deliberately misrepresented as a planned Antifa civil war. For weeks beforehand, we kept telling people on the right, there is no civil war planned. However, between troll accounts and conspiracy theorists, our attempts at outreach fell on deaf ears. When November 4th came and went with nothing more than a few small RCP protests, the right took a victory lap, claiming that they scared us off the streets. This same reaction was playing out within hours of the Virginia rally. However, some people did seem willing to reconsider their previous positions. Virginia was an opportunity to unite around a common issue, and on the ground, that's largely what seemed to play out. Where we go from here is anyone's guess. I've had the good fortune to be invited on the radio a few times to talk about this, and the hosts have been very receptive to me and the additional information. Perhaps this can be the basis for discovering additional points of unity between leftists and everyday people. It is my belief that there are far more points of unity than either of us are aware of, and I don't say that without cause. In my travels, I have managed to find common ground with nearly everyone I met, and that can't be ignored. In a world where we are all in this mess together, the ruling class can only benefit from us dividing ourselves on issues where we can actually come together on. Go talk to someone and talk politics. Get to know someone on a personal level. Dehumanization of your neighbor only serves the powerful. It takes a village, and we have a lot of work to do. Until next time, thank you for listening. If you would like to be a guest on this show, please reach out. Stay strong, dream big, and never give up.
'Cause there's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky. The animals as they go about their lives. Feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes. But tonight the cell keeps me enclosed. For if we don't have our freedom, if we are captured by their iron hands, then the vision for fire, it burns so much more bright. There's no justice in this system, a bigger cage is still a prison. Well, I hope that somewhere someone breaks free tonight.